There's a significant presence of multinationals in South Africa compared to other countries. I'll just give you a bit of the figures in terms of South Africa, how much it has been doing in terms of the illicit financial flows. So far, from 2002 up to 2011, it has lost about 107 billion dollars in illicit financial flows. That's according to Global Financial Integrity, and it's ranked as number 13 in amongst developing countries in terms of illicit financial flows. So it's in the top 13 of countries that are most affected by illicit financial flows. So, of course, during this period, 2000 to 2011, it is, the illicit financial flows have reached some peaks, but also it has declined, especially I think in 2010. In 2010 and also I think in 2006. But on average, it has been on the increase. Out of this amount that South Africa is losing, 80% of it is actually from trade mispricing. That is with multinational corporations. And like was pointed out yesterday, that Africa as a whole, when you look at Africa, it's losing 60 to 65% of its resources, of its illicit financial flows are accounted by multinationals, right? And whereas 30 to 35% is through drug trafficking and smuggling and other activities. And only 3% is from corruption. Corruption by the elite or the well-placed. Obviously, these estimates, they are, a lot of people have contested them, from which have been published by Global Financial Integrity. But I think what is important is that at least we are having figures out there that actually tell us the magnitude of the problem. They may not be accurate, but I think it's a very good starting point that we are now talking figures. And obviously, as civil society, I think we need to do a lot in terms of, accompanying those figures with real stories from the communities. So also, there's been a positive relationship normally between the exports and illicit financial flows. So in the case of South Africa, there is a correlation of up to 80%, 0.8. So in other words, the higher the exports, the more likelihood of illicit financial flows. But what this just shows is that the export sector or the multinationals really play a very active role in terms of illicit financial flows in Africa, and South Africa in particular. So what I've done so far is just to highlight on what the figures are for South Africa. I'm going to look at the regulatory aspect now to say, in light of these figures, what's happening. South Africa is regarded as having quite a solid regulatory framework in terms of illicit financial flows, right? So this has been said by the UNECA, as well as U.S. State Department on money laundering, as well as even the South African Revenue Service. But the regulatory framework, basically, it's covering aspects. So in terms of the acts that specifically speak to illicit financial flows, in South Africa, they have the Financial Intelligence Center Amendment Act, Prevention of Crime Act, as well as what they call FICA Commencement Act of is it 2006 or so. So these acts actually are the ones that regulate or they guide the illicit financial flows in South Africa, or that try to monitor and do something about it. But also, in addition to that, according to the law, there is criminalization of drug and money laundering, which is, I think, common in a lot of countries. And also, the banks are required to maintain records of large transactions or suspicious transactions. They are also required to make a report. The moment they are convinced that a particular transaction is suspicious, they are supposed to make a report to the key institutions that I'm going to talk about later. And also, the banks are authorized to trace as well as freeze any assets through the asset forfeiture unit, any assets that they suspect is emanating from illicit activities. And also, the banks are also permitted or allowed to control the flow of currency in and outside the republic. There are a number of other bank-specific regulations that have been enacted to curb the illicit financial flow scourge. But in light of this, you'll find that a lot of it is mainly focused on money laundering, right? Which is just one component of illicit financial flows, right? And if we look at South Africa, has been receiving, I think, a lot of kudos from Financial Action Task Force, as well as Eastern and Southern Africa Anti-Money Laundering Group, in terms of, that really they are leading in terms of anti-money laundering. But I think in essence, that's all they're doing, right? The other aspects of illicit financial flows, in spite of the fact that 80%, as you said, is multinationals, is kind of like escaping the radar. So, like I said earlier on, there are key institutions. I'll just run them down. I mean, maybe for those in South Africa, you would know this. They have the Financial Intelligence Center, that is really the key institution that is supposed to collect information, analyze, and make reports of anything related to illicit financial flows. And they have made significant progress to date, but like I said, it's in the anti-money laundering sphere. They have also gone to the extent of signing a number of bilateral arrangements with other financial intelligence centers in Singapore, Albania, Angola, Botswana, etc. But on anti-money laundering, still, there are also what they call accountable institutions. These are institutions that provide services. I mean, these are like attorneys, casinos, public accountants. These are they receive, because of the nature of their business, they receive some monies, right? So they are also regarded as part of the anti-money laundering kind of like system, and they have also obligations in terms of reporting suspicious transactions. They are also supervising institutions that include the Reserve Bank, Financial Services Board, National Gambling Board, Law Society, among others. Then there are law enforcement institutions, which include South African Police Service. The Reserve Bank is also part of that. Then the Asset Forfeiture Unit as well. I think in light of all that comprehensive array of laws and institutions that try to reduce illicit financial flows, the SARS, the ex-SARS South African Revenue Service Commissioner in 2011 really noted that illicit financial flows remains one of the big challenges, which actually they have not done much about, and basically he was calling for the involvement of other players, to try and help government. But to date, there hasn't been, so the involvement of other players has mainly been focused on strengthening what is existing, those institutions. But in terms of really civil society involvement as well as others to try and, especially in terms of detecting, monitoring and ensuring that there's compliance, that is largely not happened. And also, I think the focus or heavy focus on anti-money laundering has mainly been due to the fact that, you know, this anti-terrorism web, somebody talked about it yesterday, whereby really the United States is providing some support or some funds for what they're calling capacity building for anti-money laundering, aimed at reducing terrorism and others, you know, and South Africa has been actually receiving a lot of that, you know, so it has been mainly targeted to stopping anti-terrorism. And also, it has been, so if you look at even the requirements for reporting of suspicious transactions and so forth, these are, it just assumes that, or the legal framework is mainly focused on what actually gets into the system, right? But when I'm talking of these illicit activities, they're actually something that go unrecorded, you know. So really, I think it's not enough to have institutions. It's also important to actually, as civil society, see what actually these institutions are doing in terms of addressing the most dominant forms of illicit financial flows in the particular countries. And also, I think one other issue or loophole in the legal framework is that you rarely see, even in the newspapers or elsewhere, recorded whereby there have been some prosecutions that have been effected for those who have been caught on the wrong side in terms of illicit financial flows. The last that happened must have been 2007, I think, when Trevor Manuel was finance minister, and actually he pardoned those that had been fingered in there with the hope that this is going to actually reduce the practice, but it didn't. And so if you look at the justice system, or those guys who are normally convicted of anti-money laundering, it's not anti-money laundering is not also even a standalone charge, right? So it's one of the main charges. So somebody is convicted of, let's say, it could be, let's say, being involved in drugs or other crimes, but on top of that, there's anti-money laundering, you know. So it's kind of like lumped, you know, with other charges. So even if you have to look into the statistics in South Africa to say for a certain period, how many people have been convicted of anti-money laundering, which is actually what the system focuses on, you can hardly get that as a standalone issue. And also, I think the other thing is that there is inadequate capacity to monitor and enforce compliance of actually the anti-money laundering regulation that is there. So even in anti-money laundering, there is still some loopholes, in the sense that I think the key institutions that are supposed to, the accountable institutions as well as the supervising that I talked about, they normally don't, you know, work cohesively, you know, in terms of be it prosecuting a case or, you know, detecting a case of illicit financial flows. And also there is, I think, a bit of narrowness in the scope of the existing anti-money laundering regulations, in the sense that it doesn't require the banks or those in the financial system to actually get information or go beyond looking at somebody, maybe a customer who has come to deposit money, but also to check actually the people behind the person, you know, just like they do in companies, to want to say, okay, these are the shareholders, but are there some people behind these shareholders? Who are they? You know, the faces behind the actual thing. So yeah, those are some of the issues. And also, I think in terms of monitoring of that, there is still weak protection of whistleblowers. If you are to detect anti-money laundering or illicit financial flows, there isn't much in the judicial system or elsewhere to ensure that those whistleblowers are actually adequately protected. So the forfeitures, asset forfeiture unit also doesn't have adequate legal provisions to protect the whistleblowers. A lot of these weaknesses are actually acknowledged, and in our interaction with SARS on this issue, they acknowledge that this is really, a key challenge, and so far, I mean, they don't really seem to have like an immediate solution to that. So, as civil society, obviously, there is scope for working with the authorities in terms of detecting as well as monitoring what's happening on illicit financial flows. I think in terms of what CSO needs to do, I've talked about some of them, and some of them were mentioned yesterday, but I think it's important that CSOs also are knowledgeable about the issue of illicit financial flows and are able, we don't have to necessarily be technical, but I think we also need to be able to provide evidence through community stories and argue for the case, for our case in terms of the lack of focus on the dominant forms of illicit financial flows and the kind of controls that should be in place. And also, there is a lot of information out there on illicit financial flows. What we can actually do as CSOs is to work towards consolidating and warehousing a number of that information, and in terms of what that means to the different, to the different groups, the different sectors, in a way that really connects and relates with the people. The reason why also there hasn't been a lot of citizen activity around the issue of illicit financial flows is that the issue appears distant, right? So appears distant in the sense, not that, you can tell somebody that yes, we are losing 100 billion, but in the sense of how it directly connects with them, So I think that's also where we need to focus on, so that it's something that is in the now, which you can easily relate to. So thank you very much for. I think that's what I just wanted to highlight in terms of the case of South Africa. But you may find that also in your various countries it's also applicable. And I think it's important for us as CSOs as well to also do this kind of analysis on the kind of regulation, because legislation or legal framework, because at times somebody can be caught, a multinational having or rather is convicted or implicated in illicit financial flows, but the legal framework doesn't really provide for external action, or somebody can just, they externalize, like in the case of South Africa, 2007, those guys externalized, I think it was around billions, right? And they are pardoned, right? In some cases, they are made to pay fines that are really ridiculous. So I think there has to be that kind of match between the legal framework and what's actually obtained.
As he was presenting, I was trying to pick some of the CSO responses, and they came out clearly from his presentation. And some of the responses that I picked from that is that as civil society we should accompany the figures that we intend to come up with the real stories that are happening in communities where mining is taking place. And that is a very good response that civil society should take. Another thing was the fact that as civil society we should try to monitor what is happening in as much as illicit financial flows is concerned, as well as playing a leading role in providing capacity to the institutions that matter, including tax administrations and the government. Then maybe in addition to that would be the ability of civil society organizations, especially regional and international, to engage regional institutions that matter, so that they can come up with a regional provision to curb the illicit financial flows, be it at SADC level, be it at EAC and other regional institutions. Then he also talked about the need to follow what is done to address the most dominant forms of illicit financial flows. I think we mentioned issues of corruption, issues of MNCs and criminal activities. I think we shouldn't be addressing them haphazardly. We should look at forms to address them specific to each form of illicit financial flow. And it came out clearly from his presentation. Then that buttresses the three key responses that I mentioned yesterday. The one about providing evidence, forming coalitions among civil society, and the need to maintain that linkage that we talked about yesterday about grassroots and regional and international civil society organizations. And also, yeah, that talks about the strategic engagements that we should have. Maybe trying to avoid confrontational engagements, but having other forms of engagements with our governments and other institutions that matter. I think that's what I picked from his presentation.
For me, what was really particularly interesting for me was linking the presentation that we've just heard from the guy from ICCM on mining and social protection with this issue of illicit financial flows. Though the Resource Governance Index that Revenue Watch Institute, the research that they did, links that poor governance within African nations is one of the issues that maybe why Africa is failing to provide the development it is supposed to attain from its minerals. And I think from yesterday, I got to understand that corruption is just a small percentage of how we're losing out. More is from the illicit financial flows that happens. And as that, I think it's really our obligation as CSOs to really ensure that we try as much as we can to equip our governments with skills, especially within the regulatory institutions that are supposed to do this job, because that is where we are losing. So I was really, really impressed with the idea of really trying to impart that knowledge that we have as CSOs within our respective countries to those regulatory institutions, that they can be able to try to curb those illicit financial flows that are happening within the companies. And I think it's about getting our government at times that misplaced priorities. Though we've got minerals and so much natural resources, but there are various methods that these companies are doing that is really undermining this. And it's a matter of trying to ensure that capacity may be putting as a priority the capacity of the regulated institutions to ensure that we at least try to maximize on attaining the tangible benefits from those mineral resources. And for me, I think it would be important for us to also do investigative researches as CSOs, so that we try to have exposés that really show the illicit financial, flows that are happening within our own, countries, so that at least, that can be used as an evidence-based when we go to the, to the regulatory institutions that, this is happening, and it is really important that we find trying to curb such issues.
Do we have sort of specific regulatory proposal for how to address that? Because it sounds like
That's the key one.
right. It's like what's the specific legislative proposal, and is that what you're gonna? Okay, and then I wanted to reinforce what others have said, is that it sounds like government capacity to address these issues, and then I guess it's going to be trade mispricing, kind of working on government capacity should be a priority. And it sounds like creating public demand for them to prioritize that is something that we need this evidence for, and connecting this data to real stories of real people will help create that public demand for prioritizing the government to improve its capacity in this particular area rather than in other areas, maybe like money laundering.
If you look at, you get into trade mispricing, what is it? There's this issue of under-invoicing of exports, over-invoicing of imports, as well as transfer pricing and so forth. So I think what is required is really issue of capacity, right, of the various agents, state agents that are involved or that deal with, you know, the exports of commodities, including even the ports of exit, you know. And I think probably in Africa, if I'm to talk of Africa in general, this is maybe worsened by the fact that there are so many trade barriers, you know, to a free flow of goods and so on. So a lot of goods, you know, end up maybe escaping the radar. But I think that's one thing that needs to be done in terms of strengthening the capacity. I said earlier on that the US is providing capacity building in anti-money laundering. So not really to say that maybe US there is no, the trade mispricing is not there. But I think if that is also to be, you know, complemented by capacity to, you know, reduce the trade mispricing, you know, that could also help, you know, that could also help, because I think in terms of anti-money laundering as well as anti-terrorism, the capacity building that they've done is really yielding some positive results, you know. So that shows what happens when. And also the other thing could just be, I think, something to do with also the technology ability of these state institutions as well to acquire state-of-the-art technology that, you know, enables them to really see. For example, if something is passing through the ports, you know, if you have state-of-the-art scanners that tell you what this is, you know, rather than, you know, having somebody standing there opening this, you know, at the end of the day, they just leave something going on. Something is, you know, it's maybe it's actually a mineral ore going out, but it's disguised as something else, you know, because the process is a bit tedious. And so I think those could be some of the things. But we're actually talking about reducing that, you know, and elimination. Obviously, that's something a little bit far. There is an element of corruption as well, but I think if we get those capacity issues in place, I think that will go a long way in terms of reducing that. Yeah.
First of all, I work with Tax Justice in Africa, which is basically a Pan-African organization, a research and advocacy organization on these issues. And our focus really is to try and bring together national campaigns with a global campaign as well around tax justice and this financial flow. So we work with national movements, tax platforms, or NGO coalitions in individual countries. Now, I think from the discussion we've had resulting from the first presentation, it's quite clear that we're talking about a set of related issues here, from money laundering, corruption, tax avoidance, tax evasion, smuggling, and traditionally the other things are called financial crimes, isn't it? If you look at money laundering and all the other things, those are the traditional things that our governments are used to dealing with. And if you look at the laws, most of them are tailored to deal with those traditional financial crimes things. There are very few countries in Africa, and elsewhere, who have regimes in place that can deal with the other non-traditional financial crimes like tax avoidance. So there is a coalition of civil society called Financial Transparency Coalition, FTC, which brings together groups that do work on corruption, Transparency International, groups that work on money laundering, the Global Financial Integrity, groups that work on tax, precisely because of that reason, which says that these illicit financial flows are multidimensional in nature. So I think each country context will present these issues with a slightly different nuance. But one thing which is common among them all, as we saw yesterday and today, is that of all the countries affected, tax avoidance is the biggest issue of all this. So I think there are different strategies and approaches we can talk about later on when we're dealing with that. So I'll rush through some of the things we spoke about yesterday in terms of definitions, but just to remind us, I chose to stick with the second one, which is a GFI definition, which is, I think, simple in terms of talking of keeping it simple. So it's any money that is illegally earned, transferred, or utilized. And if it breaks laws in its origin, movement, or use, it also fits in that definition. So I think that's sort of the most simplest definition of what illicit financial flows are. Now, there have been various questions being asked, so I want to be very thorough. So there's a difference between illicit, they're related, illicit versus illegal. So the term illicit refers more to ethical issues, something that is not morally accepted. It may be legal, but not morally accepted. So, for example, the classic cases of slave trade, apartheid, in their times, these things were legal, but they were illicit. They are not, moral. Then illegal, of course, is obviously it's the opposite of legal. So something that is outside the law. Now, in terms of our topic, illicit financial flows and capital flight are not the same thing. Capital flight is a narrower term and is an expression that mostly is used and usually focuses more on the countries that are using. And the problem with the capital flight, it suggests that it's a one-way stream. It places the blame on developing countries where the flow is coming from. And the traditional explanation for capital flight has been because you have corrupt leaders who are looting the countries and corruption. Illicit flows is a broader term that clarifies that the phenomenon is actually two-way. For illicit financial flows to happen, you need different set of actors, institutions to facilitate that, and systems which we'll look at. So there's a victim themselves, the countries losing the money, there's a people facilitating that, and then there's a beneficiaries where the money is going to, those who are benefiting. So illicit flow, financial flow is a much more broader term and represents much more the reality than capital flight. This is a repetition. In terms of why we focus more on illicit financial flows and specify why tax avoidance is the biggest component of that. So we saw this yesterday. Africa is losing up to 1.4 trillion over that period. And these flows are mostly, 95% of them are in those regions. West and Central Africa, North Africa, and Southern Africa. And again, like it has been mentioned, more than 60% of these flows are in the extractive sector. That is why it's so important for that. Now, in terms of the mechanisms, so it's just how this happens. So I'll focus a bit on transfer pricing. Like I said, I'll be a bit technical, but you can discuss that. So, first of all, transfer pricing is, as far as the case is now, is perfectly normal, legal business transaction. But it's abuse of transfer pricing that is unacceptable. So it's just an arrangement where two or more businesses which are related, so if one is a subsidiary of the other or one is a mother company, if they're involved in buying and selling things to each other, companies buy inputs from each other. Now, because they're related, they have control over the price of whatever they're buying and selling. Now, if that transaction where a company buys something from a related company, if it can be shown that the price at which that product has been bought is close or the same as the price it would have been bought for if it was on the open market, then that transfer pricing arrangement is okay. But if it's the opposite, that they're controlling the price for different reasons, then that is transfer pricing abuse. And that is what most transfer pricing rules tries to cut out. It's not a transfer pricing arrangement itself, it's the abuse of that. Now, the problem with transfer pricing regulation is that for goods, for tangible goods, which are sold normally, it's okay because everybody can tell the price. You can Google the market price of something and judge whether that arrangement is legal. But there are different types of goods, like intangibles, intellectual property rights. For example, what is a market price for a royalty or for a brand? And there's some specific goods, especially for mining. Mining, you find that there are components which are manufactured, which are only used by that specific mining company or that machine. They're not sold on the open market because they're very specialized goods. So there is no market price for such a good. So again, it becomes difficult in such a case to tell what to compare the reference price to that. So that is the challenge that most countries have in terms of doing that. So like I mentioned, it's not illegal, but transfer mispricing. So the abuse of transfer pricing is transfer mispricing. or transfer pricing manipulation, or abusive transfer pricing. So they're all these interchangeable terms. Now, this is a bigger problem because 60% of all world trade now takes place between multinational companies. At least 60% of international trade happens within related companies. So that's the first mechanism, transfer pricing. The second mechanism is misinvoicing of trade transaction. Now, this is perhaps the most common even in Africa, especially involving government procurement. So you have a scenario whereby a good will be under invoice, meaning the value of the price will be reduced for a country that's exporting. And then the goods are then sold at the full value once they're out of the country. So in short, then the difference is what's expatriated, the difference between the actual price and what they've actually quoted. So that difference really goes to an offshore account in somebody's pocket. So the country loses out because the tax, for example, will be charged on the undervalued price, not on the full value. So it means the country will earn less tax revenue. Then there's opposite, over invoicing if the country is importing. So it's just the opposite, depending on if you're exporting the good or importing the good. A typical example is the government, for example, issues a tender for construction of a public building. I'm a Chinese company or Dutch company. I come to the government officials in charge. I say, it will cost me 20,000 to build you this building. Then the government officials might tell me, or I might suggest to say, but I can quote you 30,000 instead of 20. Then the 10,000 on top is yours. I will deposit in your account. So that's one example, and it's very common in public procurement as well. But also companies use that a lot, multinational companies amongst each other.
Say, one mining company is importing raw materials from any other company. Yeah, so there is a buyer and a seller in this case. So a buyer can pay the normal price for the product and can be given a bill that that has been overestimated. Then in that case, under misinvoicing, the seller in this case can receive that money, then the extra amount can then be transferred to a tax haven.
Yeah. Sometimes, as you see, the difference can be taken back to the country, and that's the round trip. Yeah. So in most cases, it goes away out of, but it's not uncommon for the extra money, because I'm the one, the companies are the beneficiaries anyway. At the end of the day, they're doing all this so that they reduce their costs and avoid paying tax, but the money still ends up with the company. How it ends up is different ways, through a tax haven, which they control, a company where there's a company, shell company which they control, or it can come back in the country as FDI. It can be cleaned. Okay. Yeah, it can come in other form as as investment into another plant. Or something. Yeah, we can talk about it. Let me finish the presentation.
Sorry, just one quick other clarification, and then the reduction in, so they're trying to avoid taxes for the seller and the buyer if it's
on one. There's only one party usually. So, for example, if this car costs, if you're out of the country, I make cups in Zambia. I'm exporting. I'm selling to you.
Yeah.
The price is 10.
Okay.
The tax is 10%, which I have to pay the government of Zambia.
Right.
I can reduce that tax amount by quoting, by saying this capital costs 8. 10% of 8 is less than 10% of 10. So already I've reduced my cost.
Tax. Okay.
Yeah. So
I buy for 8.
you buy for 8. I give you an invoice. I give you an invoice for 8. But you know the actual cost is 10. You pay me 8, it means you owe me 2.
Okay.
But we're trying to get that 2 away from the tax authorities in Zambia. So the 2, you will either deposit it offshore, or you can deposit in my account back in Zambia in another form, not as payment for the cap, as something else, maybe as investment or something.
Got it. Okay.
Right now, Zimbabwe is auctioning diamonds in Antwerp. So what is happening is we have a delegation comprising of the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Mines, representatives from the diamond mining companies. So they carry the diamonds to Antwerp. When they arrive there, they negotiate with the Antwerp buyers to say, guys, the worth of the diamonds we have is $40 million. But we don't want to give this 40 million to the Zimbabwean government. So you are going to say you've bought the diamonds at a cost of 10.5, you know the price that they sold in December. And the 30.5 million, I'm not sure whether it went to tax havens or they were given hard cash which they distributed among themselves. And they came back home and declared that the diamonds actually were very poor quality. So we sold them only for 10.5 million. But we all know that the price was 3 or 5 times higher.
Yeah.
So that's under invoicing.
Yeah, so that particular example is a combination of under invoicing and pure tax evasion.
Yes,
exactly. Because there was
Collusion.
complete collusion and complicity.
We have to
Yeah,
hide.
but you get the point.
Yeah.
About the individuals, that's nothing compared to. I know billion sounds a lot, but believe me, the kind of thing that happens among individuals and government, that's nothing compared to the scale that happens among multinational companies. 60% of all trade is among them.
Wow.
So using this price financial transfer is just another way. The others are very specific, but this is, for example, people have heard about thin capitalization. I'm a company. These 3 companies are also part of my company. This company specializes in financial services. It provides financing to companies. This one for something else. So I come into Zimbabwe. Then I say, I'm going to borrow money from this company. If the interest rate, the market interest rate is at 3%, because this company and I were related, I can tell her to lend me at 10%. Now, when you're paying back the loan, the interest repayments in most countries are taxed. Isn't it? They are taxed. So what you do is when you increase the interest rate, you increase the cost of your money, you've reduced your tax liabilities. So that's one example of this kind. It's called thin capitalization. Some countries have got rules. What percentage of your investment you can finance from borrowing from a related company. That's how they deal with this. It's 25% in most countries. The average, the ideal is 25%. Other countries, when companies negotiate with African governments to remove that, to remove the cap, to say, allow me to borrow 100% from my own sources. So that's one way they do that.
Just a practical example, there is an incident of thin capitalization in Malawi. We talked about the uranium mining company, the Australian one. So it's at 80-20.
Okay, that's a rule. 80-20. 80-20 means they can only fund their investment from a loan from a related company up to 20%. So that's a cap. They can't borrow more than 20% of their thing from a related. So the other thing is real estate, houses. I think it's common. People can inflate. If I'm buying a house from you, we can make a separate deal. You inflate it more like what happened to diamonds. Then the most difficult thing is the last one, the intangibles, the royalties. Most companies now they'll pay royalties for brands to their fellow company. So for example, Coca-Cola working here in South Africa will be making payments to another Coca-Cola company based maybe in Netherlands for the use of the brand. All the big companies do that. Now, what is the market price for brand of Coca-Cola? Because the brand for Coca-Cola is not traded on the market. So there's no way of telling. So we can set that price amongst ourselves. I can inflate it to reduce my cost and reduce my tax liability. The others are obvious ones: smuggling of cash, literally walking out with baskets of cash from the country. Luxury yachts. This is very common among high net worth individuals, where they invest all their money, they buy a yacht and then sell it as a way of getting the cash. Illegal exports of currency, so that's just trading in money. Then diamonds, examples from Zimbabwe, gold, illegal drugs, other high value commodities such as arts, antiques, rare coins. These serve as a means to disguise the hard cash. So a combination of all these factors together constitutes the mechanism in which countries lose money. So you can see this is not just unique to Africa. This happens across the world. Now, for the extractive, I think what is interesting is also this misreporting the quality or grade or both of traded products. So, because the way minerals are valued, especially precious stones and diamonds, they are valued not only by weight but also by quality and color, and then the quality is what determines the price. So I can say this diamond is grade B instead of A, because grade A costs more, so I pay more tax, so I can undervalue the quality. Or if I'm carrying copper, I can mix it up. I can mix the copper concentrate with some gold waste, and just say this is, and declare only copper. But then I'm going to process the other impurities to get gold, and that's the most problematic thing for extractives for mining. That's why most governments have very vague ideas of the quantities and qualities of the mineral. So it's difficult for them to put a price to put it, because you can't tax something that accurately that you don't know in how many quantities or quality you have. So the misreporting is a big problem. Then the payment of bribes and corrupt money is offshore. Of course, that's obvious. Round tripping is, instead of the money going offshore, it leaves the country first and then comes back somehow in one form back in the country. Imagine that transaction we had for the cap. So she owes me $2. Okay, so I'll give you $1 for that. So you owe me $7. There are two ways I can get that money back. The 1.9, whatever it is. Either she deposits it directly in my account, offshore. Because again, I don't want the authorities to know that that money is mine, because they'll tax it. So an offshore account is beyond the reach of authorities. Or I have another company which says, which they make tabs, but it builds roads. So I can tell her, can you buy a machinery for me, road construction machinery? And then bring it. So I can declare to say, oh, this is my investment partner in that other company. So this machinery was brought in the country for building a road. They will not make the connection between the cap export transaction and that.
And they won't charge tax, they won't tax the...
Because in most cases, most of our investment in Africa have exemptions. So for example, if it's in agriculture, for example, you find that it's zero, you have all these concessions. Yeah, so you get it in.
Oh, okay.
And you can sell it.
So you bring it in with
machinery.
something that has an exemption. You bring it in.
And that is where the facilitators will come in. So you're going to have tax planners for you, the accountants who advise you the best way to bring that money, taking advantage of the regime in that country, to make sure you pay the minimum amount of taxes.
That's tax avoidance in a way. It's not evasion.
You see, the problem is that it's on the borderline of illegality. Right? Because, for example, when you said the cap was 8, already broke the law. Because you get false information. In your tax returns, you have to declare your true nature of your transactions in the tax returns. So if you tell the authority to say the cost of this are this and not this, then already you've given false information, which is illegal, and that's tax evasion. So it's a mix of both. Now, like I said, for there to be illicit flows, you have the victim, the people losing the money. In this case, most countries who are losing the money. We've got the facilitators, those who are making it happen, who are doing everything to make it happen, to clear the way so that these things are done easily, and we can do that. So these are what I'm calling the facilitators or enablers. So it's driven by a web of the traders and facilitators who exploit the international, because the international financial system and the trading system work together. And it's so complex to navigate by individual countries. But then there are dedicated people, lawyers, accountants, bankers, and then people who are specialized in forming shell companies. So I can go, and that's the tax haven thing. I can go to tax haven today. I can have as many companies as I want, and without my name being anywhere on those. So there are people who know how to go around doing that. So all these people work together, including companies, of course, to make sure these things happen. Now, according to tax havens, most people, one of the common features which is well known for tax havens is that they've got lower tax rates compared to most countries. That's one of the attractions, but it's not the most important attraction for companies. It's most of them have got secrecy laws. That is the biggest commodity that tax havens sell. The fact that companies can do business in those places under total secrecy, away from authorities, is the most valuable thing about tax havens. And that's the most damaging feature of tax havens. So a lot of our advocacy is around transparency around, making it even beneficial ownership thing. We spoke about it, where you don't know behind this company there's someone else, you don't know the real owner. That's what tax havens thrive on, the ability for them to be able to do that legally. So if you look at the combination of that and the power that companies have, because multinational companies have got many, many times the sizes of our GDPs, so they can afford to do it. They can construct their structure in such a way that it's still same. That's how they are able to construct all those structures.
Will you remind us of some of the common tax havens?
Yes, you can mention. Okay, so yeah, not all tax havens actually are offshore. Offshore is not offshore geographically. Offshore is like out of reach. So, for example, Delaware in the US is not. It's a tax haven. London, City of London is a tax haven. They don't have a show, but they do have a beautiful show. Mauritius is a tax haven. So the characteristics of a tax haven are: one, if they offer ridiculously low tax rates compared to others for the same kind of services. Two, they offer secrecy. These are the two common characteristics. Now I'm going to tend to look at what are the current approaches in terms of what's being done so we can say transfer pricing is the biggest, most damaging thing around tax avoidance, tax evasion. And the problem is that most of our legal the rules now in place, whether in individual countries or international multilateral rules, do not deal with transfer pricing. They only deal with things like money laundering and smuggling, and those things can't address these issues. The common framework now is under the OECD, sort of have been the champions for a long time. The OECD is a group. Do everybody know who the OECD is? It's a group of rich countries. I think there are 26. Yeah, about 20. All of them developed countries who set the trend. Basically, they come up with all these tax rules and different kind of areas. But they also have a tax committee, tax section, which comes up with these rules. So the current transfer pricing rules, which most of our countries follow, are based on the OECD model. Just like the World Bank and the IMF would send in armies of their experts to come and train our Ministry of Finance officials, to come and set up fiscal frameworks. The OECD does the same thing as well. It sends its people to come and talk to our Ministry of Finance people around how they should put in place transfer pricing rules. Some countries have just a template, a generic template, which is modeled under the OECD. It's just a copy and paste of the OECD. Others have gone beyond that, but using the same model still and put in place some specific legislation. Zambia just did that now. It updated its transfer pricing regime to the OECD level. But the problem with that is that this is the OECD model which has failed. This is why there are all these calls for reform. It has not worked for the reason I mentioned, the difficulties of the arm's length principle. The OECD rules on transfer pricing is based on the arm's length principle, which is simply what we're talking about. The arm's length principle means that any transaction between related companies should be as if there were transactions with unrelated. Yeah, that's arm's length. They should be at arm's length. Okay. Yeah. So now the arm's length principle is difficult to implement. One of the big problems why it's difficult to deal with this is that the way multinational companies work, they work across borders. And if you remember, multinational companies' preoccupation, you don't care where they are, but their main preoccupation is to maximize profits at the center, at the headquarters. So if a company works in 5-6 countries, including Zambia, they don't care. They can afford to declare zero profit in Zambia if the tax rate in Zambia is high, and shift their profits to someone else where the tax rate is low, usually tax haven. They'll declare zero profit. They'll not make zero profit, they'll just declare zero profit. And then maximize their profit somewhere else. So what matters to them is maximizing the profit at the center. Now, and because of that, they can construct themselves. They set up, by design, they set up themselves across the world to maximize that. So they can be anything in different places. There can be different things in different places. But our country's rules, tax rules, are such that our revenue authority has only jurisdiction over the country. So our countries are still working nationally, but multinational companies are working across borders. So that's difficult. So this proposal says, instead of charging, the current arrangement is that instead of taxing multinational companies, regardless of where they make their money. So for example, a mining company would be mining all of its copper in Zambia. and is shifting all its profit outside Zambia to Switzerland. So most of the tax will be paid in Switzerland. And Switzerland has nothing to do with copper production. This proposal says we have to come up with a formula or a way of making sure there's a relationship between the amount of tax that a company is paying where it's actually doing most of its production, where it's incurring costs, where it's paying most of its labor bills. There should be a relationship. So it should pay more tax where it's doing those production. That's what, in simple terms. So it's a formula that apportions. So if a company works in different countries, does different processes in different countries, there should be a formula which says, okay, if 20% of your production is in country A, you should pay 20% as an example of tax in there. If 80% is in Zambia, then 80% of your revenue. So it will treat the company as one, not split it up. It will treat it as one, but apportioned according to where it makes most sense. It makes sense, doesn't it? You pay the more money you make in a specific places, the more tax you pay in that place. Now what happens? Glenn, was an example, makes most for the copper mining company establishment, gets this copper in Zambia, has more staff, more machinery actually mining in Zambia, but pays more tax revenue in Switzerland for the same copper. And yet Switzerland doesn't make any copper products.
How do you actually deal with the legal structure that has meant that they are separate entities, and when we say they should be treated as a whole?
Yes, so this proposal is about changing the rules. The accounting rules stipulate how a company prepares its accounts. Remember, this is an artificial, the way company is constructed, it's an artificial, it's on paper. So, and because as long as they're within the rules, nobody can do anything about it. So that's the starting point. One of the key demands is the accounting standards should be changed to compel companies to report in the manner that we're proposing now. The way they should prepare it. We don't care how they choose to, how many subsidiaries. But if the accounting rule says, if you produce most of the copper in Zambia, we need you to tell us, how much you're paying there. So we'll come to the proposals later on. But it's about that, it's about reforming the legal rules. Not national. It's hopeless for one country to change its rules. It's hopeless. Nothing will happen. The company will just move from that country to somewhere else. And everything continues. So the idea is to have multilateral global rules that are binding on all countries. Then multinational companies will be subject to those kinds of standards regardless of where they choose to go. The state can tax a business on the share of total profits derived from genuine economic activity within the state. So it will deal with things like you are paying for management services on fictitious company that has nothing to do with that country. So those kinds of things will not happen. So if you have to show that the management said what you have to show the service or product that you're paying for, that it actually happened. Now a company can just put an X amount as payment for management services. But it's difficult for the revenue authority to actually know whether that service was provided or not. Okay, so these are about formulas. Let me go to the most important points. So now this is a comparison with the current thing, arm's length principle, that reduce income to legal entities, which allows profit shifting to tax havens. Those source rules must be used to attribute income. So the current arrangements, the OECD ones, they just follow the legal nature of the company. But we all know, because of lawyers, companies can just set up. So some of the things that country by country reporting would do is to require a company to publish profit, loss accounts, balance sheet, cash flow statement in each of the countries it's working. Currently, companies are only allowed to produce all this in a consolidated manner, like one global thing. So it's difficult for Zambia to know what happened to this company in Congo, in Zambia. Because if countries don't know, they can be played off. So this we spoke about some of the rules that are coming out of the Dodd-Frank we spoke about yesterday in the EU are following this principle. The difference with these kinds of things compared to the EITI or publish what you pay is that these are binding rules. The publish what the EITI is just a voluntary standard. It's not couched in legislation. And you depend on companies, and companies are limited in the amount of information they're required to provide under EITI. But with the country-by-country reporting demands, they have to provide more detailed information even about the costs of production, the wage bills, etc., which will be helpful for countries to actually prevent companies from playing them off against each other. Now, the response to the OECD, because we've seen those criticisms about the arm's length principle, the response that the the UN came up with an action plan, what they call base erosion profit shifting. Base erosion is simply when companies do everything they can in their way to reduce the taxable profits. So they erode the base from which countries can tax. So they call this initiative base erosion profit shifting. There's an action plan, 15 points that needs to be implemented with the hope that it will deal with some of the problems. So this is very much led by the OECD. Now the problem is that some of these, most of African countries, actually very few apart from some of the BRICS countries, are engaged in this process. We don't know, for example, as TJN, we've been working with AirTAF, we're trying to get their views, what they think about this action plan. So one of the key action points for civil society is try and engage with our governments at different levels to try and let them come up, speak out, have a voice. They don't have to agree with what's here, but they have to tell us what they think about this, and if they have alternative proposals, they have to brainstorm as African governments to say, okay, this will work for us, this won't work for us, or these are the challenges we've been having, and this is what we think should be. The problem now is that African governments have been very passive. It's still being led by the Western countries. So the risk is that even if tangible outcomes come out of these action points, we still risk having a Western developed country driven process to which our countries will just be reactionary. Then the other problem with the current action plan is that some of the proposals are quite good proposals, but then obviously there will be likely to be more like political resistance from tax havens. For example, Switzerland, there are things that are being proposed that countries who benefit from the current arrangement may find that, okay, we're going to lose out. So it's very much a political process as well as a technical process. Now, there's a civil society group that has been set up to try and respond and react and criticize and monitor this process. It's called the BEPS Monitoring Group. It's a civil society group. TJN Africa is part of that group, and the others, Christian Aid and others. So the aim of this group basically is to follow this process and try and create links between these sort of high-level things with groups like ourselves, like here TJN Africa and other people interested in this group. So they produce drafts because the OECD asked for comments and submissions to the different steps. So this group, part of the things to be doing is to produce draft papers and comments. And that's one area, in terms of the technical work, that's one area that African civil society can also react to, because these things are circulated. Or at least you can follow what's going on and engage with our governments to hear what their views are. Most governments, I think they have not formed any official views as yet. Even ATAF is, they're still trying to get their heads around this as well. Yes, so this is the end of my presentation, but maybe I can combine it with what we're doing, what we need to do. When I said, I mentioned that there are three key areas which of advocacy, like our key demands. One is around the transparency in the way companies do business. That's the country by country reporting, like the way companies should report around that. The other one is around putting an end to the secrecy, where someone can actually open a shell company without knowing the true owner of the company. So beneficial ownership. So there should be rules that compel, that review, like a register of companies and who are the real owners of that. Then the other one is, I think you mentioned something about how money, in some countries, money laundering and corruption, in terms of the legal, like they are lumped together with other kinds of crime, right? So I think there's some cause as well to make, money laundering like a specific crime, like, because in most of the countries it's quite fuzzy in terms of the legal framework. For Tax Justice Network Africa, engaging with African governments, some of their key priorities are around this tax competition. That's what's common among all the African governments. They are trying to get around the problem where, because they feel compelled to attract FDI, they are sort of reducing their tax rates. They're giving incentives, they're giving away basically their revenue collection, policy space. So ATA, for example, has started working with them around some regional framework, like they're calling it the tax incentive framework. So maybe that's scope for civil society to look at how is that one of the effective ways of dealing with that. Yeah. But also, if you look at the BEPS issue, it will still deal with some of the issues around automatic information exchange and some of the other things that our governments grapple with. Again, like I said, the most challenging thing with engaging with African governments on this is that the BEPS thing is still relatively new for most of them. So there are no official position. But that's an opportunity for civil society, I think, because if we do some more thinking ourselves with our European partners, we can already try and anticipate some of the problem areas or propose that we can try and push towards our government. Like we try and influence them to come up with specific positions around that. Yeah.
I'm a journalist, and the more that can be learned from there. I mean, everybody knows beer.
Yeah.
So I mean, maybe to use that as an example.
Now, the difficulty with doing investigative work around this is that because of the nature of the subject matter, companies are quite secretive about tax information, even tax revenue authorities. I think they've got these rules around, not dealing with third parties. Yeah. So already it's very difficult to just get tangible data which you can then make credible conclusions from. However, sometimes a bit of luck as well. For example, in Zambia, the case of Glencore, by pure coincidence, someone leaked to us an audit report that was commissioned by the government to audit the Glencore subsidiary, and these were two auditors, a Norwegian audit firm and I think a UK platform, in which the auditors line by line spelled out all the different things that the company was doing. These things, a classic example of those things I spoke about in practice: transfer pricing, exaggerating costs, even freight costs. For example, when they buy an input from Durban, they charge the freight cost as if they bought it from Rotterdam. And things like there's discrepancy between their wage bill and their wage register. So when they look at the number of staff that they declare and the number of the amount of wage that they say they pay, there's a discrepancy. And they were making conclusions at various points, the auditors. So one of the conclusions was that when they compared the transactions of this Glencore and the subsidiary, they were not at arm's length principle. So in short, they violated the OECD principle. Now, what can the government do in such a case? So first of all, it's very difficult to prove that, and then Glencore also had their own defense on that. In fact, Glencore's defense for the whole audit report was that no, the auditors simply don't understand mining. The audit was flawed, the methodologies were flawed, but the auditors also pointed out that when they began the audit, Glencore was an cooperative from the beginning. They gave them wrong ledgers, false information, which is also a crime in most countries. And they also advised the government to reassess the tax liabilities of Glencore because they believe that Glencore was actually going out of its way. So it was tax avoidance in most cases, but in some cases it was also borderline tax evasion. For example, giving false information should be illegal. So that is a rare case where you have tangible, independent data from auditors. Most countries don't get that luxury. So then you go the route of action aid, where you do investigative work. And most of these countries have headquarters in Europe or America where they've got freedom of information laws, where it's easy for you to find out information about that. So that works sometimes. But in our countries, for example, if I go to a multinational company in Zambia, I'll get nothing. They are not obliged to provide any information to us. So it's difficult, but when it happens, it's very good. So the sub-Miller case, in fact, what we did, we used it also to lobby ATAF. Like I mentioned yesterday, we presented the case to ATAF, and then ATAF decided they were going to investigate this case further in Tanzania, Ghana, and Mozambique. But when they tried to investigate further, they couldn't because there was no treaty among the two countries that allowed for information exchange. So that forced them now to talk to their members, and now they're talking about some regional treaty of some sort. So that's a very good example of impact. But then in terms of African governments, I think what you still need is something that is going to raise the capacity to talk about. Because for me, capacity is one of the problems, yes, but it's not the most important problem. Today, if we dealt with the capacity problem in tax administration, we won't solve these problems too. Because it's beyond capacity. Because it's a multinational nature of the problem that makes it so difficult. So it's not just about building capacity of ZRA, which they are doing, which is fine as well. But then most governments, again, if you say, oh, we are putting in place transfer pricing rules, they're just getting the OECD model, copy and paste.
I think as Africa, it's high time we move towards advocating or urging our governments to adopt or implement capital repatriation schemes. Internationally, there is what is called the STAR initiative. It's the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, which was jointly launched by the World Bank and the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime. This one, what it does is that it offers technical assistance upon request from asset recovery country cases. let's say, for instance, money that we have money that has been transferred to tax havens, and we have the evidence to there is trace of that. What they do is that then if Zimbabwe asks for that technical assistance, it is then assisted in recovering all its stolen assets. So that is one avenue where as African, as civil society, we can urge our governments to adopt that and request for that assistance, so that we can recover our stolen assets, which we can then use to finance other development projects in our countries. And then the second one is to do with harmonization of offences that have to do with that deal with money laundering and crimes that are committed at home and abroad, so such that they become like universal. If we are able then to prevent illicit by nature of laws at national level or at regional level and internationally, then I can say illicit financial flows can then be prevented before they escalate into, before they escalate. And then the other observation that I noted is that in Sega's presentation, you only touched on the international mechanisms for curbing financial flows, but I also thought that maybe you should have touched on the regional initiatives that have been in place to curb financial flows. For instance, the aid-wide and funding financial flows.
Where I have challenges is on international instruments. I don't think I have any faith in them. I believe we need to appreciate the reality of the new scramble and the partition for Africa that is taking place at the moment. That these multinational corporations are actually agents of their governments. Okay.
Facilitators.
Yeah, exactly. They are facilitators. And I believe these international instruments like OECD guidelines, the Dodd-Frank Act, are very tokenistic. It's like, I've worked in the Kimberley process for the past 5 years. I've stopped attending those meetings because I was seriously disappointed to realize that the KP is just a face saver for the blood of the Africans that has been shed to extract diamonds from Africa. I came to realize that the jewelers and manufacturers of diamonds who loot all these diamonds from Africa, they are not even part of the Kimberley process. They are not regulated by anyone. And yet, you don't find, it's rare to find an African wearing a diamond ring. They are all consumed in the West. But when it comes to regulation, normally we blame our governments for not being transparent and all those things. So my challenge is that these are voluntary instruments like OECD. There's really no prosecution and even reporting them. Sometimes, for example, I'll give you an example of this Dutch company which went on to dump toxic waste in West Africa. They were fined, I think it was 3 million or whatever euros. And the money, that fine, it was consumed in Europe, not in Africa, where the crime was committed. Similarly, with the Dodd-Frank Act, if by chance an American company is prosecuted for acquiring materials in a conflict zone, that money is spent in America. It's not like the fine will go back to Africa to correct the anomaly. You talked about Zambia, the issue of copper. I'm aware of that problem, that copper is processed in Switzerland. Switzerland is a member, I think, of OECD. So it's like you are reporting to the criminals when we talk about these international instruments. So my solution is that it's in Africa, it's not out there. If we get our politics right, we get our governance right in Africa and say, enough is enough. No more looting of our resources. I like what the president of Guinea said 2 weeks ago. He said, enough is enough. You've been looting our resources under a dictatorship in my country, but now it's time that every Guinea resource has to be accounted for. So I think we need to start looking inward and say, how can we change our governance system?
How can we sit back and then trust, for example, some of these international mechanisms that are being developed to curb illegal financial flows? If, for example, the same organizations or countries have now realized that the framework that they used has failed to work. And it's from the same countries where we're having the multinationals who are contributing to 80% in terms of South Africa and over 60% of illicit financial flows globally. So to what extent can we be content and relax that the new framework is going to help? I feel like what he's saying is we basically need to, I know you said that it's difficult for individual countries in terms of international government level to come up with a framework that can curb that. But I think it's for us to think like, where are the multinationals investing more? Yesterday, at the beginning of the Indaba, we had this keynote speech from the doc, and he talked of that critique that he did on Africa rising. So if the investment is coming to Africa, it should be the African countries or the third world countries that are providing the raw materials now that need to awaken and come up with mechanisms. I know it's going to be a very, very difficult thing, but I think we've got enough brains and experience from the exploitation that we have suffered that we can come up with our own mechanisms. If, for me, I keep on saying, if it means first delaying the development that we are having, like we said, let's stop first mining, let's stop extracting, and try to come up with ways and frameworks of how we are going to manage our resources before we can then go out and say, okay, you guys, we feel like we are prepared, can you come over now? These are international cartels that they are going to actually develop. When they see that we are realizing what is happening, they will say it's not working, we are helping you. They go to another level. When we are here, they develop these frameworks at that level. We feel like they are trying to help us. But within the same new system, they are going to keep on stealing, exploiting us. By the time we realize they are at another level. So we need to come out of these circles and try to actually confront it. It's them and us, and not both of us together. It's a very complicated thing.
In our countries, like in my country, I'm sorry if I'll be boring you, but the court, is the head of states who appoints the judges, who sets up the tender board, who's also having companies who are owned by the royalty, and you can you see that. And he's also a board member, if not a board member, but a shareholder in all these multinational companies. So tell me, how can we actually get into the deeper, revelation of these things, this corruptness and the illicit flows of money that are happening in these companies, when the man in charge, the top man, is the one who is safeguarding the interest of the multinational companies. So it becomes difficult. And I was going to invite the ATAP to say, when our crew comes from Swaziland, as you've said, they are also coming from Swaziland to discuss this kind of things. Probe the more who are the owners, who are the shareholders of these companies, because most of these companies, they will never reveal who is in their board, who is the shareholders. I can mention the Coca-Cola Foundation, where His Majesty is the MTN mobile network is also a major shareholder in all the mining companies. So he's one person who is key in these multinational companies to ensure that he protects their interest. And he is also a Swazi, but part of them wherever they are. That's the challenge you are facing.
Excellent. If you look at, to conceptualize the structure, if I may be a bit political, we have to understand also the structures and systems that are this. I don't agree with you that it's them versus us. It's not Europe versus Africa. This, I think for me, is class, about class. These things are happening here because there are African elites who are benefiting, who are colluding together with multinational companies and the West. So for me, I make that distinction, not them versus us, but it's more a class problem. even in Africa, our very own politicians, like you've said, the example you've given, are the very one who are actually colluding and making it possible for this to happen. So it's not a matter of Europe and Africa. The distinction is different conceptually. So where I was coming from is that, first of all, what we're trying to do is to dismantle the structures and systems that perpetuates these injustices. Now that's how we share that goal, and I agree with you about that. But that's a goal, that's a long-term goal. Where I was coming from is in terms of tactics. So I think we're talking at different levels. So I agree with you at that level. That should be our overall goal, to function and change and radically reform these systems and structures. Now, how do we do that in practice? So, and there are different ways we can attack that. There are different ways in terms of mobilizing and working at community level, engaging technical work, the inside-outside strategy. Some of us can be stone throwers, some of us can be there on the table. And we play these different roles depending on the context. So what strategies that work in Swaziland would be different from Zambia. So Zambia, for example, has got relatively much more space for civil society. We can demonstrate, for example, you can pretty much get away with insulting the president. I would use different tactics to get these issues. If I come to Swaziland, from what you're saying, I would have to think about different kinds of way of doing it. Even investigating companies, I agree with you, it's not the same thing that has to be done everywhere. So I think we need to make that distinction between the bigger picture, understand the links, understand these power structures, which are not East versus West or Africa, no. Now that distinction is not there. These permeate our societies. These are our very own politicians who are colluding with companies and other people to make these things happen. So, but I agree with you in terms of what we're aiming for is to reform the governance structures. But how we do that is what I was talking about. Different ways. It's not the only way. It's different entry points. And then quickly, for Tafadwa's point, my personal view is that I think that's one area as well, capital repatriation. But for me, I don't think that should be the most priority. I'll tell you why. If you look at the amount of money that is already out, that's like waiting when it's a bit too late. That's like you wait for the cat to get out of the door, then you say, I want to chase to bring back the cat. That's what, for me, that would be doing. So in terms of priority, look at the resources we have. If you want to invest Africa resources to do that, and most of the STARS program and most of the effort around that is getting back looted money by individuals, by politicians, looted from bribes and all those kinds of things, from wood sector type or budget type of loot. If you look at the size of that money, you probably spend same amount or more trying to get it back, and it's a drop in the ocean compared to the amount of money that we have to prevent. For me, we have to prevent the money leaving first. So yes, maybe there's a principle behind that. I agree. There's a principle to say Africa is owed. There's debt owed to Africa because of that. We shouldn't forget about that. But in terms of choosing where to put our efforts as Africa in terms of resources and where we can make the most impact, I think preventing money leaving in the first place, more money, again I repeat, more money leaves Africa from multinational companies than from any other form of illicit force. But before, the paradigm, the narrative was that the focus was on corruption, to deflect the attention away from the responsibility of the Western companies. So they were saying, the money is leaving because of corruption, because of corrupt politicians. Yes, it is, but it's very minimal. So if you're focusing on the minimum, then you can see that we are distracting from the main important thing. So I would not prioritize it. I would keep an eye on it. I would keep it there as an issue, yes. But in terms of going in both legs, and we have to choose, I think, because we have limited resources. That would be my personal opinion.
In our presentations, we've been able to identify those kind of CSO responses at those levels. Maybe what is only remaining for us at the moment is for us to make a distinction between the responses that I alluded to earlier, to classify them in terms of national level. As a way of maybe adding to what we have discussed earlier, I will go through the additions coming out from Sylvia's presentation. Then from there, I will go through what I have captured so that we can classify them accordingly. Is it regional? Is it national? First, CSO response accompanying figures with the real stories from communities. I think this is a national strategy. I think we talked about linking illicit financial flows and their effects to daily life, so that everyone becomes involved. It should not be limited to policy levels. We want to make that linkage with how it affects the daily lives, so that whoever is working, maybe a civil society at grassroots level, will be able to translate that and communicate that with the communities. And by so doing, it takes us to another CSO response, which is about mobilizing people to create demand. You know, when we create demand as civil society operating at a regional or national level, sometimes some civil society organizations in our local countries, like Center for Natural Resource Governance, in Zimbabwe is considered to be an enemy of the state at that particular level. But if we manage to mobilize communities in the fight for their rights, the government can respond, rather than having Farai's voice over. Then the other issue was detecting and monitoring progress that our governments are making towards addressing issues of illicit financial flows. I think that is another national strategy. But I'm sure it can also be a regional strategy, because with the African Union, it has set its own standards of commitments. So as regional organizations, we should also keep on monitoring progress in as far as those regional standards are concerned. Then, linked to that is the issue of reinforcing our regional engagements with regional institutions. Then the issue of civil society providing alternatives, because we have certain standards at national or regional organizations, which we view with another critical eye. Suppose we criticize them, but the civil society should be able to come up with alternatives. Then the other issue is about, I think the issue of providing research should not only be limited to the civil society. I think that's where the media should come in. I think the civil society is used to working with the media, so that they can come and cover the things. But we should create this image where civil society and the media work together in investigating these cases. With the investigative approach by civil society. And I think the media is very important for the investigative journalism. So creating that, those linkages, both at national and at regional.
I think as civil society we need to train to detect illicit financial flows. Like a lot of issues that he was raising, I think you really need training for you to identify and track those illicit financial flows.
That's both at the national but also at the regional level.
Yes, and also link with the media. The media is very important in this whole thing. So there is need to build these synergies between civil society and the media.
How can we actually tap into each other's different technical expertise so that we can keep this thing going, and not, for example, wait for Africa, for the Tax Justice Network to come and present their findings next year in Cape Town or wherever we're going to be, and then you also do this and that. Is to see how do we continue this collaboration, and if, for example, is need for research on what we want to research and what the different interests, and how do we undertake that, how do we disseminate the information, including the issues of funding, because some institutions might just be good for funding, some for strategic direction, technical. I think we need to do that, so that then we are able to remain abreast with the issue.
Celia presented on the OECD model, and a lot of people, they contested the OECD model. And I would just want people to note that we learned with concern that the UN, which is the world board dealing with issues of net taxation, relies on the OECD in terms of their capacity. So I think as part of the response, I don't know whether at national or regional or international level, I think as civil society we should push or demand African governments to contest the involvement of the OECD into the UN as a world standard setter. So that should be another response.
Like most countries, depending on the country, some have platforms like coalitions where they deal with these coalitions. So that's our mandate, to support those coalitions. So even like the researchers we're doing, and I can share those, we're doing researches like in East Africa, SADC, on these things. We don't do everything ourselves. What we do is we go to a country like Zimbabwe, we say, who are the poor in this area? Then we say, can we partner in a case study for Zimbabwe? We support technically that work in terms of, the research itself, and we probably can fund it or co-finance it. When the results come out, it will be a joint research report, but because it was involving Zimbabwe's specific case, it's easy for Zimbabwean organization to carry those forward and use it. So those we can do practically. And I would encourage you, I can share information on where there are already fully-fledged platforms. And even if there's no platform, still there's nothing preventing you from just keeping these issues as part of your work. And then you can give whatever sort of support, including the media. We have lots of media trainings already going on in this area as well. And then the second part is that last year in Lusaka, at the meeting, after that meeting, there was, from MPs, we had agreed, there was a demand from the members of parliament that we work with the idea of forming an African parliamentarian network on these issues, on illicit flows, which again, we can support, Africa and ourselves we can support. But you see, if we're talking about mobilizing communities, those are the kind of actors that we should also bring on board. So that if we identify a few champions, because not all everybody agrees, a few MPs who are interested, who are champions, we can work together with them in our communities, so that they are also helping push these issues in our parliaments as well. So the more people, actors we identify, okay, the better we can do that. So I think we can come up with a set of proposals based on what is coming here. And then there's some things that are immediate that we can say, okay, this is what this is going on, maybe we can, those want to be involved, follow up, sign up to mailing lists. And I agree, capacity building is important, and that's already something that can happen now. So on Friday, it was supposed to be more than one day. So Friday is more like orientation, but the concrete thing we agreed with the AMI organizers that every AMI will be running trainings on these issues, like fully fledged trainings, maybe 5 days, where we took it, which we'll share on Friday. So in the next AMI in Zambia, there will be a training like this, the next AMI in Botswana, in Malawi, and even the next one here, at the end there will be a training. So that we have all those who are interested, there's a constant pool of people that are interested in this. I think this partnership between people working with the communities on other issues and people working specifically on this is important because they're related. And we don't know how to connect the human face, for example, if we don't have links with the communities. We can't do that. But so I think I agree, we need to do that. So I don't know if it's too much to ask that we commit to something. On our end, we can commit already like what we did. We can just say, okay, these are the simple steps. If it's information sharing, if it's a media, there's this email list going on, we can be sending information. And then I can send information about each country, about which groups are already working on this, and where there are no groups. I know Angola, for example, is no one. So in Angola, if I find someone here from Angola, I'll be talking to them to try and see if there's any interest or they have someone. But the good thing is, in all the countries here, we can already connect with what's going on.